Hello and thank you for joining me in this Mind Mastery video. When we start reflecting on what influences our actions and decisions, we usually can trace it back to our needs, our desires, our motivations, and what we want to have in our lives, what we need, right? But the deeper we go, the more we can find about these influences. So I think that obviously a part of our needs and desires, we can also say that what mostly influences our decisions and actions is our interpretation of our experiences. So basically what happens to us, what happens around us, what we perceive to be happening, how we understand, how we make sense of our experience. And this process is quite automatic. Our brain is wired to make sense of our experience, to take all our perceptions and basically place them into a coherent whole so that it all makes sense to us. It's all coherent. So in a sense, we are meaning-making machines. Our brain is wired to make sense of our experience, to take all pieces and place them into a coherent whole, to spot patterns. For example, our brain develops something called schemas, where we take similar items and place them into the same category so that it's easier to spot them in the future, so that it's easier to understand, to name things, so that we know what we're seeing, right? And since it's all automatic, we have to put an effort into questioning our experience, or rather questioning our interpretation of that experience. So in order to question that automatic mechanism, we need to be willing to kind of sit down and pause rather than going about our day-to-day life, right? Because it's automatic, we can't just assume that our brain is going to do it for us. Although I think that after a while, if you do start questioning yourself, if you do start questioning your interpretations on a regular basis, it might become like a habit. Regardless, if we take together all these interpretations and our understandings of our experience, this creates our narrative. So basically, the story of our life. And basically, the narrative is the story we tell ourselves. Is the story of our life that we are the main actor or the main actress of, right? So this narrative is basically composed of things that happened in the past, right? So we can say that, oh yeah, this and that happened. And we can also say that the part of the narrative is what's happening in the present moment and what's going to happen in the future. So again, because our brain is automatically wired to make everything into this coherent whole and make sense, our narrative is usually quite coherent, at least in theory. The problems usually start when, there are gaps in this narrative, when there are some inconsistencies, or there is a dissonance between different parts of our stories, right? And usually that's where we start questioning what is happening to us. That's usually the moment where we, sit down and think, okay, what is going on? What is really going on in my life? Because our brain, or even we as people in a general sense, we can't tolerate these experiences where we can't make sense of what is going on, right? So we either shut down and live in a denial where we simply don't pay attention to certain elements of our lives, or we ruminate over the same ideas over and over again in order to make sense of it. And I think that's what often happens to people with mental health problems, where we start questioning our narrative, where we start paying attention to how we interpret our experience. It might be a very anxiety-provoking experience in general sense, because if you can't make sense of what is going on, how can you make decisions? And also when you start questioning that narrative, it's like being in a place where nothing makes sense, in a sense. That's, of course, an extreme example, but of course, not having this coherence, not having this coherent narrative, this coherent story is anxiety-provoking because it's threatening to our existence. And that also, I think, applies to the other end of the spectrum, to some people who might be depressed, right? They might give up on making sense of their lives. They might say, okay, everything is pointless, or nothing makes sense. So in a way, whatever they try to interpret, however they would try to put things into this coherent whole, it doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't make sense to them. So in a way, it's going to be depressing, because if nothing makes sense, how else can you make decisions? You don't know how to make these decisions anymore because it doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense, right? So I think this kind of highlights the importance of having this narrative and coherent story of our lives so that we know what is going on. And then we can, based on that interpretation and narrative, then we can make really good decisions. And it's a simple logic, right? It's better to try to make sense of our experience as much as we can than not. It's better to have our interpretation of our experience aligned with the reality itself, rather than having a split so that our experience is removed from our linguistic processing or the narrative itself. If there is the split, if there is a dissonance, then nothing is going to make sense. So the question is, how do we create as much harmony between these two aspects, between the experience itself, between the reality and our interpretation of it, our story, our narrative? I think that the drive is always there. We just need to listen to it. And it's especially evident when something completely shocking happened to us, something traumatic, for example, something that violates our schemas. That's where we often sit down and start questioning, like, what the hell has happened to me, right? What the hell has happened? That's the first question we start asking ourselves when something violating our schemas happens. And until we make sense of that experience, until we make sense of that event, we're going to be, you're ruminating over it. We're going to be disturbed by it. We're going to be unsettled, because then how can we make decisions if that big part of our life doesn't make sense to us? But do we really need to wait until something bad happens to us to start questioning our narrative, to start paying attention to how we make sense of our experience, to how we create our stories? I think it's way better to, go into this maintenance mode as often as we can, so that we can troubleshoot problems before they arise, so that we can spot whether our interpretations are correct, whether we are avoiding something, whether we are in denial of something, whether we avoid something because it's too uncomfortable. And yes, questioning our stories, our narratives can be uncomfortable because it throws us into the unknown. It makes us realize that we are in this very weird world. It is quite weird out there. And the more you ponder over it, the more, it's marvelous, it's amazing, but it's also quite scary. Because the universe itself is so vast. We don't even have to leave Earth in order to be amazed. So when we start questioning the stories, when we start questioning the narrative, it can lead us to a very strange mental space where we realize that, there are many different interpretations of our experience. There are many different interpretations of what we perceive and what's going on around us. And that can lead us to wrong conclusions where we might say that, okay, so if there are many different interpretations which might be equally correct, then maybe nothing makes sense, or there's no point in explaining anything. But I think that there is a point of why we are capable of explaining our experience from many different perspectives. Because the more perspectives you have, the more data is available to you, and the more correct your interpretations will be. Because if you, for example, take an object and look at it just from one perspective, obviously it's going to be inferior to someone who looks at the same object from many different perspectives. That person will have much more data, much more information on that object than you. So when we do work with our narrative, when we do work with our interpretation, I think it's important to leave this idea of being able to have a perfectly correct interpretation of our experience. And it is more about moving from this single-pointed perspective, single-point perception, to this multi-perspective way of seeing things and of interpreting things, which will yield more detailed data on your experience, on your narrative, right? So I think that maybe it's not so much about what sort of conclusions we're going to come into, although obviously that's important because the conclusions will then determine our decisions. But it's equally important, or even more important, to say that It's more about how we make these interpretations, how we make sense of our experience, how we perceive things, right? Because this method or this kind of meta perspective we take on ourselves will then direct us to a kind of wider view of ourselves and our lives, where we step outside the single perspective, this kind of reality tunnel that we are all embedded in at one point or another, because, that's the kind of automatic way our brain is working to, get a coherent way of our lives and just be done with that, right? Because that's it. It's the easiest and simple way, and it's coherent, so it's comfortable. And moving from this place of comfort, it's going to be anxiety provoking. But at the same time, if you start thinking about the potential rewards and the potential expansion of your understanding and knowledge, then I think it's worthy to bear a little bit of discomfort, bear a little bit of anxiety in order to expand our view and expand our understanding, so that the representation we hold about ourselves and the world equals the actual reality, if such thing is possible at all. But I think there is a point why we are having this mechanism of interpretation of the reality, and why people often question their narrative when things go wrong, when things go shocking in their life. Because having a coherent perception, having a coherent interpretation and their narrative, or the story we tell ourselves, is a priority. It's a starting point on our journey. That's the point from which we make further decisions. That's a point which enables us to understand ourselves. Having needs and desires is one thing, but if we can't understand them, if we can't perceive them in the first place, it's going to be hard to tune in to this process. It's going to be hard to listen to our bodies in the first place. So when we're dealing with any sort of problems in our lives, I think it's beneficial to use the starting point of making sure that our interpretation of what's happening to us is correct. And in my opinion, very useful to this process is our ability to stay grounded, to be mindful of our thoughts, be mindful of our actions and how we make our decisions, how we think about our experiences, how we think about other people, how we make sense of what is going on to us. And if you would like to work on staying more grounded and being more mindful of your everyday actions, I offer the Awareness and Dissociation workshop, which you can join today. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.